They say love doesn't ask for permission before it barges in. It doesn't care whether you are ready, whether your life is neat or broken, whether you are dressed in silk or wearing a faded thrift store dress that smells faintly of the road. When he found me, my life was the exact opposite of the life people assumed a man like him would choose. I was just another quiet shadow in Lagos, a city where dreams either burn bright like neon on the island, or fade quietly into the darkness of crowded streets on the mainland. My days were long, slow battles for survival, moving between small jobs that never lasted, always working for people who would never remember my name. He, on the other hand, was a storm dressed in Armani, a man whose presence could make an entire boardroom fall silent. His name was spoken like it was gold-plated, his image flashing on magazine covers, his movements followed by cameras and whispered about in private dinners across Ikoyi rooftops. He was the kind of man people described as untouchable. We were never supposed to meet. But fate doesn't respect the invisible walls that society builds between people. It was on a humid Thursday evening, the kind of Lagos evening where the air hangs heavy and the streets are thick with the mixed smells of roasted corn, exhaust fumes, and designer cologne. I was walking along a narrow road in Victoria Island after leaving one of my many temporary cleaning jobs, my small bag clutched to my side. I remember feeling that sharp awareness of being out of place among the polished cars and glass-fronted buildings. That's when it happened. Not a movie-style collision. Not a dramatic rescue. Just a moment. A moment where our eyes met from across the street. He was stepping out of a black Mercedes Maybach, the kind of car I'd only ever seen in glossy adverts. The driver opened the door for him, and his tall frame filled the space like a carefully tailored secret. There was no reason for him to notice me. Not in my worn sneakers, my dress that had been washed so many times it had forgotten its original color. But he looked, and he didn't look away. I told myself it was nothing, just curiosity. The way people sometimes glance at what feels out of place in their perfect little worlds. But that evening, as I boarded a Danfo heading back towards the chaos of the mainland, I had no idea that the man in the suit, the billionaire CEO whose name I didn't even know yet, would soon shatter the careful walls I had built around my life. The first time he came into my world, it felt like watching sunlight spill into a dark room I had long accepted as home. But sunlight is tricky, can warm you, or it can burn. The following week I saw him again. Not on the island, but deep inside the sprawling heart of Lagos traffic, where rich cars and tired buses are forced to breathe the same smoky air. My Danfo had stopped beside his car in a standstill jam. I remember glancing out the window, trying not to stare at the way his white shirt gleamed under the fading light. And then I realized. He was looking back at me again. Felt unreal. Like the city had paused for this single exchange. Later, much later, I would learn that he had been looking for me ever since that Thursday evening. That he had noticed not just my face, but the way I walked, head down but with a quiet stubbornness, like someone who refused to break completely. When he finally found me, truly found me, it was in the most unexpected place. Private rooftop party in Ikoyi. I was there not as a guest, but as part of the invisible workforce, clearing glasses and making sure the tables looked untouched by human hands. The skyline stretched out in a shimmer of gold and glass, and the air carried the distant hum of traffic far below. I was moving quickly between tables when I felt it. That stillness, that weight. I looked up, and there he was again. He was standing by the edge of the rooftop, the city sprawling beneath his feet. His eyes locked on me like he had been waiting for me to appear. I froze, glass in hand, unsure whether to look away or pretend I didn't recognize him. But here's the truth I've come to understand. People like him are used to getting what they want. And in that moment, I could feel it in the way his gaze didn't let go. From that night, the lines between our worlds began to blur. When he came closer, his words were not what you'd expect from a man of his wealth. They weren't sharp or commanding. They were heavy, like someone speaking from a place of deep hunger that had nothing to do with food or money. That night, in the golden spill of light from the rooftop lamps, I realized something dangerous. This man, with all his power and perfection, was not just looking at me. He was seeing me. And once someone truly sees you, you can never be invisible again. Looking back now, I can't tell you exactly when admiration became attachment, or when curiosity became desire. But I remember the night he came to me. Not in a boardroom, not in the polished hallways of his empire, but in the quiet, shadow-lit streets of Surulere. He had found my small rented room. I still don't know how. The walls were thin, the fan rattled above my head, and the city outside was a chorus of car horns and distant laughter. When I opened the door, the sight of him standing there, this man whose signature could move millions, made my heart pound in ways I couldn't control. He stepped inside without hesitation, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, dangerous. His voice was low, almost broken, as he said the words I would never forget. "I want you tonight." Not as a game, not as a conquest, but as if something in him had been starving, and I was the only thing that could feed it. And I, foolish and unprepared, let him in, not just into my room, but into the fragile life I had fought so hard to protect. I didn't know then that love, in the wrong hands, can feel like both salvation and destruction at the same time. Love, when it arrives in excess, doesn't feel like calm water. It feels like a fever, something that heats the blood and blinds the mind until you can no longer tell where warmth ends and burning begins. After that night in my small Surulere room, he became a presence that swallowed entire days. It started with the simplest things. His car waiting for me outside the street at sunrise, its tinted windows hiding him from the stares of my neighbors. He never stepped out there. He knew this part of the city was not his world. But when I climbed in, he would be waiting, his suit pressed, his cologne mingling with the leather of the seats. We drove through Lagos like we were escaping something, the chaos, the heat, maybe even ourselves. On the island, he brought me into spaces where the floors shone like mirrors, where the air conditioning whispered through high ceilings, where the people moved with a kind of ease that comes from knowing they'll never truly be hungry. He dressed me in silk and lace, fabrics I had only ever touched in markets where my hands trembled before the stall owners. His fingers slid rings over mine, each one worth more than everything I owned combined. And yet, the moments I craved most were not the expensive dinners or the quiet balconies overlooking the lagoon. It was when the walls fell away, when he looked at me with an unguarded hunger that seemed too raw for a man of his stature. He told me I made him feel human again. That around me, he could shed the armor of the billionaire CEO and simply be. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that a man with so much could still ache for something as small and fleeting as the way I breathed beside him in the dark. But there was something in his eyes I couldn't name back then. Something restless. Something that felt like a storm moving just beyond the horizon. Weeks passed, and our worlds tangled in ways I had never imagined. I began to live half my life in his world of glass towers and gated estates, and the other half in the cramped streets where the air was thick with the smell of frying akara and the sound of generators humming through the night. Sometimes, he came to my side of the city without warning. He would arrive after midnight, the quiet hum of his car engine outside my window pulling me from sleep. In those moments, the line between him as the public man and him as my man blurred completely. But the more time I spent in his light, the more I realized it came with shadows. One night, as we stood on the balcony of his penthouse in Banana Island, the city glittering far below, he held me close, his grip almost possessive. From that height, Lagos looked calm like a sleeping giant. But I could feel his tension, the way his mind was somewhere else even as his body pressed against mine. It was the first time I wondered who else occupied his thoughts. And it wouldn't be the last. The whispers began quietly. A passing comment from one of his employees when I visited his office. The strange look from a woman at a dinner party. Even the way his phone would light up at odd hours with messages he didn't answer in front of me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that a man like him would always have the world clawing at his attention. That I had no right to question the life he lived before me. But love has a way of sharpening your instincts. And mine began to tell me something I didn't want to hear. The turning point came on a rainy Friday evening. He had sent for me as usual, and his driver brought me to one of his properties. Not the penthouse, but a sleek apartment on the other side of the island. I remember walking in and sensing something off. The air felt charged, like the remnants of someone else's presence lingered in the walls. There was a faint trace of perfume that wasn't mine. A glass on the counter still half full of wine. The lipstick mark a shade I never wore. I didn't ask him about it. Couldn't. My throat closed around the words before they could escape. Instead I smiled. Pretended not to notice. Because that's what fear of loss does to you. It makes you choose silence over truth. But silence is a dangerous choice. It allows the cracks to widen. And the wider they grew, the more I began to see him differently. He was still the man who held me like I was the last safe thing in his life. Still the man who looked at me with eyes that said mine. But there were moments now, fleeting but sharp, when I caught glimpses of something colder. A look that said I was not the only one. That weekend, I returned to my small room in Surulere, away from the marble floors and crystal glasses. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, the fan rattling above me. I thought about the girl I had been before him, the one who moved through life quietly, unremarkably, untouched by the kind of love that burns more than it warms. I didn't know it yet, but the fever of his love was already taking its toll. By the time I saw him again, he was different. More desperate. More insistent. It was on a night when the city seemed to breathe slower, the rain having cooled the streets. He came to me again, the same words in his voice. Words I now knew were not just about desire, but about control. "I want you tonight," he said, but his tone had changed. It was no longer a plea. It was an order. And somewhere deep inside, something in me began to resist. The richest things in life, I would later learn, cannot be bought. They cannot be forced. And when love becomes a transaction, its beauty begins to decay. But I wasn't ready to face that truth yet. Not while his touch still felt like fire I couldn't walk away from. If you want, I can move straight into episode 3, where betrayal comes to the surface, and the emotional break begins to unfold in a way that ties into the lesson about humility and loyalty. There are moments in life when the truth does not arrive gently. It doesn't knock at your door or whisper its presence in the distance. It crashes through your world like glass shattering, leaving pieces sharp enough to cut you every time you try to pick them up. For weeks, I had been holding my breath, pretending not to see the signs, convincing myself that love could survive unanswered questions. But deep inside I knew. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. The city was quiet in that peculiar way Lagos sometimes becomes on weekends, the roads less crowded, the air carrying the smell of distant rain. He had sent for me again, asking me to meet him at his penthouse in Banana Island. When I arrived, the elevator doors opened to a stillness that felt wrong. The curtains were drawn, the air too heavy, and the scent of his cologne lingered as if he had just left the room. I called his name softly, but there was no answer. I moved through the room slowly, my footsteps absorbed by the thick rugs. And then I heard it. Faint laughter, muffled voices coming from the far end of the hallway. The door to his private study was slightly ajar. I approached, my pulse a slow drumbeat in my ears. And there, through that narrow gap, I saw him, the man who told me I was his only piece, standing too close to another woman. Her dress clung to her like it had been made for her body alone. Her hand resting on his chest as though it belonged there. He was smiling, the kind of smile he used to give me when the world outside didn't matter. In that moment, the air left my lungs. I didn't wait for him to notice me. I didn't step inside or demand an explanation. I simply turned away and walked out, each step heavier than the last. The city outside felt louder than usual, the horns sharper, the voices harsher, the colors too bright for the darkness in my chest. I didn't cry right away. I simply kept moving, boarding a Danfo back to Surulere, my hands clenched in my lap as if holding myself together physically could stop me from breaking apart. That night, alone in my small room, the tears finally came. Not the quiet kind, but the kind that leave you gasping for air, clutching at your own skin as if you could hold back the hurt. I thought of every time he had looked at me and told me without words that I was his, Every time he had made me believe that I was different. And now, all of it felt like a performance. For days, I didn't answer his calls. I ignored the cars he sent, the messages that lit up my phone late into the night. But a man like him, powerful, relentless, doesn't give up easily. One evening he came to my street. Not in his usual Maybach, but in a smaller car, one that wouldn't draw as much attention. He stood at my door, his voice low, asking to be let in. I opened the door, but I didn't step aside. He looked different, tired, almost worn. But his eyes still carried that same fire, that same pull that had drawn me into his world. He told me what I had seen was nothing, that I was the only one he wanted, that I was letting jealousy ruin what we had. But here's what I knew by then. Jealousy doesn't grow from nothing. It grows from the small betrayals, the broken promises, the lies told in soft voices. I didn't tell him to leave. I simply stood there in silence until he realized that his words weren't enough anymore. In the weeks that followed, something in me shifted. I still loved him, that was the cruel part, but I could no longer love him the same way. There was now a space between us, a shadow where the light used to be. When I did see him again, it was different. We sat on his rooftop, the city stretching out beneath us, but we didn't touch. We didn't speak of love. We spoke about work, about the weather, about things that didn't matter. And yet, I could feel his eyes on me, searching, longing, as if he wanted to pull me back into that fever. But I had learned something important by then. Love is not enough if it comes without loyalty. The day I truly decided to walk away wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. I was walking through a market in Yaba, my bag filled with small groceries, when I saw an older woman struggling to carry a heavy basket. I helped her without thinking, and she thanked me with a smile that felt warmer than anything I had felt in weeks. It was in that moment, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread and the sound of traders calling out prices, that I realized I had been chasing something I didn't need. Love should feel like that smile. Like something simple, honest, and steady. Not like a storm that leaves you drowning. But storms don't let go easily. And just when I thought I had found my footing again, he came back. Not with words this time, but with something bigger. Something that would force me to choose between the life I knew and the life he was offering. That choice would be the final test. They say people don't change overnight, and maybe that's true. But moments can change people. A single night, a single choice, a single sentence can shift the entire path of a life. For me, that night came on the last day of the rainy season, when the air in Lagos felt thick with the promise of new beginnings. But I didn't know it yet. All I knew was that he had called again. Not the quick, almost casual calls of the past, but a voice heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I had been avoiding him for weeks. My life had begun to feel lighter without the weight of his presence, but there was still a part of me, foolish maybe, that wondered if he was capable of redemption. So when his driver arrived at my street just before sunset, I didn't send him away. Got into the car. We drove through the city as the day gave way to night, the streets glowing under street lamps and the neon signs of shops still open. The driver took a different route this time, away from the familiar paths to his penthouse or the rooftop bars where we had spent too many evenings pretending the world didn't exist. Instead, we ended up at a private villa tucked away in a quiet part of Lekki, far from the noise of traffic and the endless rush of Lagos nights. It was the kind of place that didn't just keep the world out, it erased it entirely. The gate closed behind us with a heavy finality, and I followed him inside. The villa was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Tall glass walls, polished marble floors, an open living space that looked like it belonged in an art magazine. The lighting was low, golden, and soft, throwing gentle shadows on the walls. He led me to a room overlooking a private pool. The water glimmered under the faint light, rippling with the quiet movements of the night breeze. For a while we said nothing. He poured wine into crystal glasses, handed me one, and stood by the window, looking out at the darkness beyond the glass. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his posture both relaxed and tense, the way people look when they are trying to find the right words but fear what will happen when they speak them. When he finally turned to me, there was something unfamiliar in his expression. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't the quiet certainty of a man used to control. It was vulnerability. He began to talk. Not about business, not about wealth, not even about love. He talked about loneliness. About how the people around him only saw the title, the money, the image. About how every relationship he had ever had came with hidden terms, silent transactions of affection in exchange for access. And then his voice dropped. He told me I was different, that I was the only one who had never asked him for anything, the only one who seemed to love him without calculating what I could gain. He said he couldn't lose that, couldn't lose me. It would have been easy to be moved by his words. And maybe a part of me was, because I had loved him once, deeply before the cracks appeared. But love without trust is like a house built on shifting sand. No matter how grand it looks, it will eventually sink. I told him I couldn't go back to what we had. That what I had seen in his study, the way he had made me question my worth, had left something in me too broken to mend. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And then, in a voice that was almost a whisper, he said it again, the same words from the first night he came to my room in Surulere. I want you tonight. Only this time it didn't sound like longing. Sounded like possession. There is a kind of silence that follows certain sentences. A silence where you can feel the air change, where you know the next words you speak will decide everything. I set my glass down. My hands didn't tremble. I looked at him, at the man who had been both my fire and my wound, and I said nothing. Instead, I stepped back, creating a space between us that had never existed before. That space was my answer. He didn't stop me when I left. The driver took me back through the quiet streets, the sound of the rain beginning to fall again against the car roof. I watched the city lights blur through the window, and for the first time in months I felt free. But freedom is a strange thing. It doesn't come without grief. In the days that followed, I mourned him. Not the man he truly was, but the man I thought he could be. I grieved the idea of us, the dreams I had let myself imagine when his love was still warm and unbroken. And then, slowly, I began to heal. Healing didn't look like grand changes. It looked like waking up in the morning and making tea while the sun slid through my small window. It looked like walking through the markets and greeting familiar faces. It looked like feeling peace in the quiet moments, rather than waiting for my phone to light up with his name. I began to notice the beauty in things I had once overlooked. The laughter of children chasing each other down my street. The kindness of strangers in crowded buses. The way the city smelled after rain. I realized that wealth wasn't always measured in bank accounts or property. Sometimes the richest life was the one built from steady, simple joys. Months passed before I saw him again. It was by chance. A charity gala in Victoria Island where I had been helping a friend set up decorations. He arrived surrounded by people, his presence still commanding, his suit still perfect. Our eyes met across the room. There was no anger there, no longing, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been and what would never be again. He gave me a small nod. I returned it. And then we both turned away, swallowed by different worlds that had once collided so violently. Looking back now, I understand that he was never truly mine to keep. He belonged to a life that would have consumed me if I had stayed. And I belonged to something quieter, truer, something that couldn't be bought with diamonds or whispered promises. I also understand that love is not just about how someone makes you feel when they are close. It is about how they protect you when you are far away. How they keep your trust safe even when you are not there to watch. He failed me in that way. And in leaving, I saved myself. If there's one thing my time with him taught me, it's this. Humility is not a weakness. Loyalty is not a chain. And the richest things in life are often the ones the world walks past without noticing. A quiet morning, an honest smile, a love that doesn't demand proof. In his eyes, I had been a rare find. In mine, he had been a beautiful disaster. But life moves forward and so did I. The last night we spoke was not the night he lost me. He had lost me long before. On the day I realized that no amount of wealth could make me forget the value of my own peace. And that, perhaps, was the only true gift he ever gave me.